Good morning, or excuse me, good afternoon, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. My various clocks here telling me it is 1:15 in the PM now. So let's go ahead and get started. As usual, if we are disconnected for more than 10 minutes, please check your Canvas site for more information a little bit later in the day. Okay, at this time, let's do an attendance check. Please type present for your attendance. If you did not sign in with your full name, be sure to include it in the message. Thank you, thank you. And I'll try to remember a little bit later to make sure if someone joined us a little bit later that they put in a present for their attendance before we get out of here today. All right, as you guys continue to do that, let's go ahead and continue with our presentation for this February, the 4th session. Okay, let's review somewhat here what we covered during the last session, the time that we were here last time. We covered in chapter 1, critically thinking with psychology. We looked at the need for a psychological science, the idea that we understand that there are certain things that we as human beings tend to do. We have hindsight bias. We tend to be more overconfident than we should when it comes to what we believe to be the truth. We tend to see patterns and randomness when those patterns really are not there. So these things sometimes have an issue with failing us when it comes to our ability to critically think and critically assess information that's been put in front of us. And so critical thinking is a very important skill to have. It's one of those skills that hopefully we'll be able to have to become really well honed and sharp by the time you leave this course. But we have these tendencies as human beings to sort of make our critical thinking not so efficient and so well. We also covered last time the notion of the scientific method, where we have a theory, which is us observing something in the world and coming up with some systematic explanations and statements as to why that is that way. And from that theory, a hypothesis can be developed. And that says if the theory is correct, given certain circumstances, we can predict what's going to happen in the future. And sometimes what we'll have to do is operationally define certain terms. Excuse me. If, for example, we're studying certain types of concepts like aggression, when we're doing the research of studying aggression, we have to have operationally defined terms because we need to both agree what we mean by aggression. And the classic Bobo doll study, which we talked about previously, in the Bobo doll study, they operationally defined aggression as the number of times a young kid would hit, kick, or scream at a Bobo doll, for instance. And then once we have a theory, we have a hypothesis, and we do studies after we've operationally defined the concepts, we then want to see other people do the study as well. Replication. Replication is sort of a checks and balances in psychology and in research in general, meaning that if I did a study and the study turned out wonderfully, it was a great study, and it was a unique study, other people will soon follow and try to do the same study again. They'll replicate the exact same experiment, or they may change certain factors in the study to see how well the concept, the hypothesis, or the theory goes to different types of populations, for example. Then we talked about research methodologies, ways in which we can conduct this scientific method. One that we talked about was descriptive research, such things as a case study, studying one individually very, very thoroughly, naturalistic observation, observing people in their natural habitat, and then surveys by asking specific questions of people and getting information in large number back to the surveyors. Now, surveys are a wonderful tool. They can tell us a lot about what's going on, but there are a lot of cautions as well. The survey questions that are going to be asked cannot be too leading. Okay, we need to understand that surveys can only tell us so much. The other method that we looked at was correlational research. the correlational research basically can come from things from the descriptive research. A case study, a natural observation, or a survey study may have variables in there that sort of suggest that they should be further examined. They are correlated potentially. And basically what we mean by correlation, we're talking about the idea that these two variables are related together in some fashion. We can see strong relationships if we have a very strong relationship between two variables. If you know one variable, you can predict the other variable. That's the basic idea you see when it comes to having included in your applications for college your high school GPA. Your high school GPA is a good predictor of what your first semester is going to be like at college, for example. All right. So one thing that we know about correlation is that we can have these very powerful, strong correlations, and they can allow us to predict one variable if we know the other. Okay, but it does not suggest that the correlation does not suggest that there's causation between those two variables. The example we covered last time was the idea of ice cream sales and violent activity, violent crimes. There's a strong correlation between those two. As ice cream sales go up, so does violent crime. But this does not suggest that one causes the other. Because in a correlation, we're looking at two variables. We never know about that third mysterious variable. So we know variable X, we know variable Y, but we don't know variable Z. In that particular instance, variable Z is the weather. When it's really hot outside, violent crime goes up. When it's really hot outside, ice cream sales go up as well. And then finally, we talked about the key research methodology of experimentation. This is the one that allows us to suggest causality. Here, we manipulate the independent variable. That's the variable that the researcher has control over. They manipulate that independent variable with the belief that it will have some impact on another variable of interest. And the true variable of interest is that DV, or that dependent variable. And the dependent variable is named that simply because the dependent variable depends on the condition or the state or the level of the independent variable. In any experiment, the key idea is going to be control. Control is going to be a key factor. We want to control as many things as we possibly can. So let's look at a very simple experiment. We have a control group and we have an experimental group. What happens before we get those two groups established, we do random sampling of a population where everyone has an equal chance of being selected into the study. So everyone in that group is a random sample. And then we conduct random assignment. We assign them either to the experimental group or the control group. We do this because we want to have two equivalent groups. And what random assignment does, it allows us to create two equivalent groups, meaning that the people in the experimental group and the people in the control group, they are basically equivalent to each other. All right? So they start off the same. And then we conduct our research study and we manipulate an independent variable. So when we manipulate the independent variable, the experimental group gets one version of the IV and the control group gets another version of the IV. Then later, the experimental group and the control group, they do some sort of test, for example, where we can measure the dependent variable again. Now what we see is that we want to compare the dependent variable seen in the experimental group and the dependent variable seen in the control group. If they're different, what we can then say is the only difference between these two groups was the thing that we manipulated in the experiment. Because when we started this experiment, those two groups were equivalent to each other because they were randomly assigned. The experimental group was equivalent to the control group. And then we controlled for as many things as we possibly could doing this experiment. And then when we measure the dependent variable later and there is a difference, that gives us a strong case that the difference was a result of what we did in the experiment. We manipulated the independent variable. So that gave us a really overview of research methodologies, the key ones that we employ. Then we talked briefly about ethics in psychology. We didn't go into ethics about clinical and counseling psychologists. We talked primarily about ethics in psychology when it comes to research. Well, we talked briefly about animal research. A lot of the things that we learn about human beings, for example, comes from animal research. We can learn quite a bit, and we'll see that later, I believe in chapter 7, that we learn so much about learning through of human beings by doing research with animals, pigeons, dogs, cats, those types of things. But one of the things that I want to highlight here and did in the last class was the notion that when we conduct animal research, there's a great protocol that has been established as to how we're going to treat those animals, up until the point when the animals are no longer needed and they have been changed or treated in such a way that it would be beneficial ultimately to end their suffering, how we put them to death, okay, euthanasia. So we see that animal research has very many rules associated with it. We see the same type of thing established for human research as well. So when people are participating in research trials for us, there are certain things that we have to follow. First of all, there's usually going to be some sort of institutional review board that's going to oversee it, all right, so that they understand that we are following the rules as researchers, okay? But other things too, for example, informed consent. We have to have informed consent, meaning that you do not participate in a research study without having some idea of what it will mean to you personally. So informed consent is us telling the participants of our studies that they can expect this, that, or the other thing, and that they're not going to be harmed. Now, also, it should be noted, especially in the social psychology, we may give them an informed consent, but at the same time, we may also deceive them. Because if we tell them specifically what the study is about, it may alter their behavior. So we get informed consent. We also take sort of an oath that we do not harm our participants in research. We also have to keep all the information that we learn as we're doing this research very, very confidential, because there's a lot of controversial topics that will be discussed oftentimes in this type of research. We maintain confidentiality. One of the rules is you need to be able to tell the institutional review board, where will this data be maintained? Will it be in an encrypted file? Will it be in paper folder somewhere under lock and key in a file cabinet? Those things are very specific and must be spelled out. And also, if we did do some sort of deception at the beginning of the research study, basically we deceived them somehow, when we debrief them at the end of the study, we must fully debrief them, explain to them that unfortunately we had to use a little bit of deception, but we had to do that because we didn't want you to be influenced by way of your behavior. And so you fully informed them that you did sort of deceive them, and tell them the true aspects of the research that you were doing, and give them the opportunity to ask for more information when you find it out. Now we're going to be covering statistics today, but before I move on, are there any clarifications or questions you have from our last session or from just general knowledge? Okay, doesn't seem to be any questions, so we'll move on then. So that sets up the stage for our conversation today on statistics. And I apologize if I may have given you the wrong ideas of what we'll be covering today. What we will be covering today will be statistics and then a little bit of information about APA in your paper. If you look on the schedule, we are slated to start our conversation on the biology of behavior next week. Okay, so I got a little bit ahead of myself and I apologize for that, but we're on track now. Okay, let's move on then. So what we're talking about today is statistical reasoning in everyday life. So we've talked about research methodologies, and we've covered that last class and a little bit of a review during this last session here. And what we basically talked about is the theory, and after the theory, we come up with some hypotheses, operational define some of the concepts there so we can actually measure them to generate some numbers. We can conduct the research, and once that research is conducted and we generate numbers, we have to do something with those numbers, and that's where statistics come into play. So it's not only about coming into play in the research, but we also need to be aware that we use them for everyday life as well. So why statistics? Well, statistics are important tools in psychological research, but they also benefit us, all of us, by helping us see what the unaided eye might miss. So there's so much that is revealed to us when it comes to psychology and using statistics to help us clarify what's going on. Today, to be an educated person is to be able to apply simple statistical principles in your everyday reasoning. In this session and in this appendix, we look at how we describe data using measures of central tendency, variation, examining a little bit more on correlations and regression toward the mean, and at significant differences, asking how to determine when an observed difference is reliable and significant. So there's a whole process that we go through in order to do that. When we are done with this session, hopefully you'll get some basic understanding of the picture, so to speak, of what statistics is for and how do we use them. A little bit later, some of you will have additional classes or may have already had some of those classes that will help clarify some of these ideas. So basically, we generate numbers in our research that must be analyzed using statistics. So we talked about the theory, the research methods, and all that, but how do we know the result of it all? And that's what statistics does for us. It helps us to make a determination ultimately whether or not we have support for our idea, or we need to look for to modify our idea or just reject our idea in totality. Okay, so that takes us to the next idea, as misleading with statistics. I'm sure you've heard terms like this before. Statistics can be used quite often to mislead people, and that's unfortunate, but it's something that happens sometimes accidentally, sometimes on purpose. Here we see an American truck manufacturer offered a graph A, with actual brand names included to suggest the much greater durability of its trucks. Okay, so we can see here our brand X brand, brand Y, and brand Z. Our brand seems to be big dog here. We seem to be in the lead when it comes to durability after 10 years. Well, what does graph B make clear about varying durability and how it is accomplished? Well, if we look at this other graph here, we see our brand X, Y, and Z, and they don't appear to be that different at all. So note that how the y-axis here, how the y-axis of each graph is labeled. The range for the y-axis labeled in graph A is only from 95 to 100. So only from 95 here to 100. The range from graph B is from 0 to 100. All the trucks rank as 95% and up. So basically, these trucks are doing outstanding, all of them, our brand, brand X, brand Y, and brand Z, after 10 years in service, okay? But that does not make us able to sell to our potential customers our brand, because our brand is much better than the other brands out there. So what this does here, by shrinking this y-axis from only 95 to 100%, then we expand that 5% or so difference, making it seem much larger than it actually is. In reality, it's all basically a flat line just about. There really isn't that much difference. So remember, as we've talked about before, we do not want to be misled or mislead. When we're dealing with research, and also when it comes to statistics, we can manipulate things in such a way that can give people false impressions, and we need to be able to avoid that as researchers or advertisers, and particularly as consumers, to realize that sometimes people can present information in such a way that it can be very, very confusing and misleading. All right, any questions about this so far? Again, you can speak up or send me a short chat message here. Okay, we seem to be going okay. All right, let's keep going then. Oh, I'm sorry, I went too much farther. Oh, okay. All right. So what we have here is measures of central tendency. And in measures of central tendency, we're trying to get some idea. We're trying to get some idea of a general number that can describe a sample or a population. All right. So each one of these here, let me change my pointer here. So we have families represented by these green smiley faces, and each one of these green smiley faces represent in hundreds of thousands of dollars, in thousands of dollars, the income of families. So we see here 30,000, 40,000, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 140, 180, 950,000, and 1.4 million. So in a particular range or area, this is the salaries that are being made by these individuals. So this graphic represents the distribution of a village's income. It illustrates the three measures of central tendency: the mode, median, and mean. The simplest measure is the mode, the most frequently occurring score or scores, and that means $40,000 represents the mode of this particular group, the most common occurring salary or income of a family. The most familiar to everyone is going to be the mean, which is basically the arithmetic average, the total sum of all the scores divided by the number of scores. And this is $140,000 is the average salary of this group of families here. The midpoint, or the 50th percentile, is the median. On a divided highway, this is the median, is simply the middle of the road. And here we have 60,000. So let me ask you this question. This is a genuine question here. Is $140,000 a good indicator of the income of this sample? Would you, if you were writing a report, would you tell the report, writing the report, that the salaries average is $140,000, or would you go with a different type of central tendency? All right, I see one person says no. Anyone else? Would you say 140,000 is a good example of this group's central tendency of their incomes? Okay, so at least two of you so far. No one else has any other ideas about it? Okay, that's enough now. So we have no, nah, nope. Okay, no. It would probably be a bad idea and very, by the way, very misleading if you did say $140,000 is the average, because there are other routes that you could take. Measures of central tendencies of 140,000 for the average here is not giving you a good representation of what's really going on. The reason why we have $140,000 average is simply because of what we have here at the far right. We have somebody, God love them, making 1.42 million for their family income. Another 950,000, another 180,000. Because of these outliers, in particular this one here with $1 million, averages are going to be greatly influenced by outliers like this, dragging the average all the way up to $140,000. And basically what that tells us is that that's really nothing more than an artifact. That's really not a good measure for this particular population. If we wanted to do a good measure of this population, it would probably be more ideal to provide the the mode of $40,000, and probably even better for $60,000. Because what we can see with this skewed distribution, most of them fall on the left side of this graph here, with some making 100, 90, 87. So probably the best number to provide would be this middle number, the median. And if you provide $60,000 as a sample of the average income, or the median income of this group, it'll probably be more realistic and more accurate than any other number. The next item we want to talk about is variation. Now, variation is how varied are the scores or the salaries. Let's say we take an exam, a fictitious class takes the exam, and the scores were all the way from 100 to 10. Okay, and that's a rather wide range. So there may be a lot of variation within that particular population. All right. So the range of scores is the gap between the lowest and the highest. It provides only a crude estimate of this thing we call variation. In other words, similar group, a couple of extreme scores such as 950,000 and 1.42 million incomes will create deceptively large ranges. And see, that becomes a problem because we see that outlier again of the 950,000 and the 1.42 million a year would be doing the same thing. So if, let's say, we had extra credit on the exam and the score was for a particular student 122 and someone got like a negative 10, okay, on this wild exam, that would mean you have this incredibly wide range, okay, and it could be very deceptive as to what's going on. So ranges give us only a crude estimate of variation. The more useful standard for measuring how much scores deviate from one another is what they refer to as the standard deviation. It better gauges whether scores are packed together or dispersed. So let's say we have the test at a fictitious class, and everybody did relatively well in the test. In fact, most scores only differed between five or 8 points, something like that. But in another test, the scores differ quite a bit, 20 and 30 points. So in one, the standard deviation is very packed together, they're very tight, whereas in the other example, they're very dispersed, okay? Because the idea with the standard deviation, it gets information from each score, all right? So the idea is that with the standard deviation, it tells us a lot more about the group that we have in front of us. A low standard deviation indicates that the values tend to be close to the mean of the set. So we have this mean, whatever the average is, and if the standard deviation is rather low, they don't deviate that much, that means they're all sort of clustered around that mean. While a high standard deviation indicates the values are spread out over a wider range away from that mean. So what this standard deviation is really telling us is what the data sort of looks like by way of how it varies. And of course, if you're doing a test, you don't want a great deal of variety. You want a low standard deviation. That means that people are sort of hanging out together when it comes to the results of a test, and people tended to get the information the same way, and hopefully it's a high mean for the class. If there's a lot of variety, that probably means a rather high standard deviation. That means people were all over the place and maybe they didn't get the concepts that well when you were teaching them, and therefore you may need to adjust something to some extent. So that is the idea of standard deviation. Now, one thing which is also a great benefit to us is understanding the normal curve. And again, some of you may have heard of this, some of you may not have heard of this yet, but this is what the normal curve is. Basically, what it comes down to, many things that exist in this world naturally fall on this bell curve, this normal curve, meaning that you'll have some people will be outliers on the low end, some people will be outliers on the high end, most people will fit in the middle. Okay, we don't want to see this normal curve with intelligences, with heights, and all sorts of things that naturally occur in the world. So this figure A3 here shows a useful property of the normal curve is that roughly 68%, right here, of the cases fall within one standard deviation on either side of the mean, right here. About 95% of the cases fall within two standard deviations. Okay, and we'll see, or you can see this in chapter 9 when they talk about intelligence tests. 68% of the people taking an intelligence test will be plus or minus 15 points around 100, whereas about 95% will score within 30 points, plus or minus 30 points. So what this tells us is that we know for a lot of phenomena out there, they fall in this normal curve and where we can expect things to be, okay, where we can expect data to fall. Now, sometimes when you've heard the term somebody curved your grades, what they may be doing is something simple like this. I don't use this technique particularly, but they're making the distribution of your test performance look like a normal curve here, meaning that some people will fail at a very low end, some will pass at a very high end, but most of the scores on the exam will fall around here. And sometimes they artificially create that, pushing people to be on the high end or the low end, with the majority of the people falling in the middle. So what we have here then is just saying how all this stuff sort of fits together. The average of a distribution of the scores is the mean. Okay, I'll fill it in for you. The score that shows up the most often is can anyone tell me? The score that shows up the most often, what do you call it? Correct, mode. The score right in the middle of the distribution, where half the scores are above and half below, is the median, correct? We determine how much scores vary around the average in a way that includes information about the difference between the highest and lowest, the range of scores. And finally, we can use a formula, and we're not going to go into the formula now, called the standard deviation formula to determine how they vary. So we can know a lot about data by understanding these particular things and understanding that we don't want to mislead people. And that's why when we have outliers, okay, someone who makes 1.42 million as a family unit, we don't want to include them in that number. And the only way we could do that and still provide some idea of the central tendency of a data set is to provide them with another central tendency, either the mode, the most frequently occurring number, or the median, the middle number. Once they have been all ranked and you select the number in the middle, that would be the median. So this gives us basic ways to describe the data that we have in front of us, how it tends to cluster together, what is the average, the mode, the median, how spread or how wide it is around that median. Is it spread out, varies a great deal, or is it very, very little, where they seem to cluster more around that average? Okay, and then we revisit the idea again of correlation, which we talked about a little bit already. Again, this is a measure of relationships. Okay, the first step toward predicting it is to see how well two variables are related with one another. When naturalistic observation and surveys reveal that one trait or behavior accompanies another, we say the two correlate. Again, that correlation coefficient is the number of that strength, and we use scatter plots to uncover the relationships between those variables. So usually correlations are going to be abbreviated with the little r, lowercase r, and they can range, as I stated before, from +1, scores for one variable increase in direction proportional to scores of another. So if we have a positive number, that means as one variable increases, the other variable increases as well. Or in the middle here, we see the no relationship, where the r is a 0. There is no discernible relationship here. They just seem to be randomly put on our chart here without any theme whatsoever, no relationship. To a -1, the scores for one variable decrease precisely as scores rise from the other. So as one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. And here, in this example, we have a perfect correlation of -1. So it's the exact opposite of what we saw in the positive correlation, perfect positive correlation over here. Now, just to give you an example, let me erase this thing here, to just think about it a little bit more, this idea of correlation. Okay, when we have this data set here for this correlation example, I'm not going to tell you to do this now. Okay, I may give you something a little bit later just as a practice if you want. But we're comparing two columns in table A1 here. most people detect little relationship between height. Okay, we have 20 people. We have height in inches, 80, 63, 61, 79 inches, all the way to 70 inches down there at the bottom. And we have anxiety scores, your sense of unease, feeling like something's going wrong, feeling uncertain about things, okay, anxiety. So we imagine here that people are completing an anxiety survey and they get a score for that anxiety survey. Either someone has already measured them in height in inches or they have reported what their height in inches actually is. And so by looking at this, what we see, this following fictitious example, the correlation between this imaginary example here is a positive 0.63, which basically means, let's see if I can get this thing to work here. So 0.63 falls beyond 0.5, so here. Hopefully you can see my cursor here, my mouse cursor. And so what this would tend to tell us is that this number, 0.63 correlation coefficient, is in the strong category. So we're seeing a strong correlation, not a perfect one. If it was perfect, it would be 1, okay? But it is a strong correlation. So this tells us that there's a positive, strong relationship between the variable of height in inches and anxiety score. Now, before we do this, before we do any type of correlation, we probably would have done a scatter plot first, just to give an eyeball examination to the data. And the eyeball examination of the data would tell us something as well. And let's look at that real quickly here. And that's what we have here. So in this correlation example, in this scatter plot, we have anxiety scores listed here on the Y and the X. We have the height in inches. And we just list everybody's score on the anxiety test and their height in inches, and then we see it. So what we see here is not a straight line, nor do we see a fat cigar. We see like a little bit of an egg, but it is pointing in a certain way, in a certain direction. So this display of data from 20 imagined people reveals an upward slope indicating a positive correlation. The considerable scatter of the data indicates the correlation is much lower than a positive 1, but it does show a relationship. And that's one of the key things that we want to make sure we understand here, is that we use all these things in conjunction with each other. We use the scatter plot to give us some idea of what needs to be done next, okay, or what we need to look at or be concerned about. Yes, someone had their hand raised. Please ask your question.
Yes, I understand that if you have like the data and the information to make the scatter plot and you can kind of visualize into what direction the correlation trend is there a formula to generate that 0.63?
Yes, yes, and I can give you access to where you can look at that. We don't usually go in too much depth, but there's a formula for everything. There's a formula for median. There's a formula for how you can do the standard deviation. And it is very helpful to see how it works. Now, one of the beautiful things about the standard deviation, I'll just put that out there real quickly, is that it takes the average as well as each score, and it puts it in a little formula so that you can get all the scores involved in there. But the way it's calculated, it gives you a really good idea without intensifying the results too much like the range does in variation, so that it gets out of hand, gives you a misleading information. But here, the same thing can be conducted too. You can do correlations by hand. I used to do them years and years ago. Normally what happens is this, when you guys go into a statistics class, which some of you will, they'll probably make you go through the process of calculating them by hand, but I have not done them by hand in a long time. I can, but the idea is that there's so many software packages out there. Even Excel is one that I use quite a bit sometimes to calculate the R for you. So there, I'll make sure there's available some of the simple formulas for calculating some of these things that we've seen here, okay?
Thank you.
No problem. All right, so now what we've done is we've seen some of the meat and potatoes, as it were, of what is done once we come up with the theory of something that we've seen, observed in the world. We've come up with a hypothesis. We've operationally defined things. We've figured out what type of research method we're going to employ. We've collected data, and we've run some preliminary analysis with regard to the distribution of the sample that we have here, even if there's some correlation between the variables and things of that nature. So all of this is wonderful, but it just tells us better ways of describing the data in front of us. The slide that I want to cover, the last slide for this particular section before we move into the next, that I want to cover is called significance testing. So we have a theory, and from this theory, we came up with an hypothesis, an educated guess as to, given certain circumstances, what will happen if. All right. So I communicated to you previously in a previous lecture that that researchers design experiments and design their research in such a way that they can be proven wrong. Okay. And that's key thing. In science, it's about big T, big truth, not little t, subjective truth. It's not about politics or anything like that. It's about what the data tells us. What are we able to uncover from the natural world around us? So in hypothesis testing, we come up with what is known as an alternative and a null hypothesis. Okay? The null hypothesis is this. And I have an example here that I was able to fish out for you guys. It's not necessarily psychological, but it highlights the point. So let's say we have some sort of biofertilizer, okay, that we think is going to be effective at doing some stuff. All right. Our null hypothesis in testing this biofertilizer would be this: application of biofertilizer does not increase plant growth. So that's the null hypothesis, meaning that we want to see if we can refute this null hypothesis or if we have to sort of accept this null hypothesis. That's us failing at our task. Let's say we're the creators of this biofertilizer. We spent years and years doing it, okay? Our 10 or 20 people in the company, and we have everything riding on this, okay? But we have to present our research and conduct our experiment in such a way that it can be proven wrong, and that's what the null hypothesis represents. The null hypothesis is a hypothesis which the researcher tries to disprove, but it's there and it has an equal chance of being selected if the data falls out a certain way. The alternative hypothesis, the application of biofertilizer X increases plant growth. The alternative hypothesis is a hypothesis which the researcher tries to prove. Okay, so we have two things here, but equally we have to design the research in such a way that it can be proven wrong or proven false. So we have to design that within the research and the experiments that we're doing. So that's the key thing I want to make sure that we understand. We have the null hypothesis that nothing is what we think. The alternative hypothesis is, yes, what we hope would happen did happen. But we have to have those both there and a strong possibility in how we design the study. I mean, I'll be honest with you. If you design a study in which your null hypothesis could not be proven wrong, no matter what you did, it would never get published, and people would easily see that this research is phony, it's fictitious. Forget about it, because you have to be able to design a study so that you have a good chance of being proven wrong. So statistical significance is a statistical statement of how likely it is that an obtained result occurred by chance. So when you generate all your data, okay, and you run your statistics, okay, there's going to be a number that's going to be generated. And this number will tell you whether or not the data that you obtained from your research was something that resulted because of your well thought out and well reasoned theory and hypothesis, or something that just occurred by crazy chance. You got nothing here. This is just a chance result. All right. So that's what this test is all about. Now let's talk about this idea of something called the p-value. Now, how many of you guys have heard of the p-value before? You can just say yes or no. You've not heard of this p-value or p before. All right, I'll keep going anyway. So please, if you've heard of it before, just tell me yes. If not, say no. All right, so the p-value is the probability of obtaining test results at least as extreme as the results actually observed, on the assumption that the null hypothesis is correct. Okay, so let me walk you through this. When we do research, we set our p-value, the p-value that we would be comfortable with, the probability number that we'll be comfortable with. All right, so let's go through the ones that we will not be comfortable with, and sometimes they'll be set that way, but I've never seen any greater than this in years and years. So a p-value will be something like this. The greater p-value, greater than 0.05, like 0.10, 10%. All right, what this is basically saying, what the p-value is saying is this. The p-value says you could have obtained this data by chance 10 out of 100 times. Okay, so the null hypothesis could still be correct, meaning there's nothing there, and the data that you obtained, you could have gotten this 10 out of 100 times, greater than 0.05, or 5 out of 100 times. So usually anything greater than 0.05, 5 out of 100 times, or 6 out of 100 times and up, like 10 out of 100 times, that would be considered, as stated here, insufficient evidence against the null hypothesis. Meaning that if it's greater than 0.06, 0.055 and higher, then we would have to say, even though we got data, the p-value for it is 0.08. That means that we cannot reject the null hypothesis. That means our biofertilizer X did not increase plant growth. All right. Now, sometimes we'll see 0.01 to 0.05. So 0.05, that means 1 out of 100 to 5 times out of 100, we could get the results that we got. That gives us only some degree of comfort, saying that some evidence against our null hypothesis, but it is significant, but it's not a great deal of evidence. So we have some support that our biofertilizer is doing something. It is growing, okay, but it's not as comfortable as we would like it to be. We wish to have the following: less than 0.01. So if we had something that said 0.0001, which is a lot more zeros than we have here, that would have strong evidence against the null hypothesis. We could not obtain that result from 1 out of 10 or so thousand times. So that's good. That gives us strong evidence against the null hypothesis. It's very statistically significant. That tells us that we're very confident that our biofertilizer X does indeed make plant growth grow faster. It increases plant growth. So that's what we mean by the p-values and what those p-values represent. So basically what it comes down to, in a nutshell, is the following. Do we have support for our hypothesis? Consequently, support for our theory. So the p-value less than 0.01 is usually going to be where most research that I've been reading these days is more comfortable. So when they get that p-value that's less than 0.01, that means they can reject the null hypothesis and find support for the alternative hypothesis. Okay, the hypothesis that the research, whatever the researcher is trying to prove. All right, I'll wait to see if there are any questions or comments on that before we move to the next segment and begin to wrap things up. We have about 30 minutes or so. We have a few more things we need to do with APA and your writing assignment, and then we'll call it a day. All right, are there any questions? You can do it through chat or speak up as I take a sip of drink here. Okay, I'm back. Does not seem to be any questions we have so far, so let's move on. So what we've done there is we've covered a real basic, quick overview of some of the key ideas and concepts from statistics that you should think of as going in conjunction with the stuff that we covered in the previous lecture on research methodologies. how it is that we come up with the theory, the hypothesis, the operational definition, conduct the study, and all this type of stuff, look at the data, and then ultimately we want to look at this p-value once we run our statistics to see if we have support for our alternative hypothesis for our theory. Okay. So next, what I want to cover is the APA writing overview, a few key ideas. This is nothing new. You guys have had access to this for a while. It's from the APA for Academic Writing thing that's been posted for a while on your Canvas site. I just want to highlight a few key ideas that I think will be beneficial to you. All right, so again, just to remind you, this stuff is on Canvas. There's a couple of things. Paper resources is one. This is another one here, APA resources for academic writing guide. We have the information that this is pulled from, is coming from here, but there's some nifty short videos about citations, formatting, references that if you get an opportunity, you should. A little bit later in the course, there will be some extra credit opportunities that will be testing you on these ideas here about citations, references, and formatting, and things of that nature. So if you haven't already done it, please be sure to view these videos and make notes of them as well. They'll be very beneficial to you. Just to understand what type of things I'm looking for in a very simple way for this class's paper assignment, but also for your future assignments in other classes as well. All right. First, what is referencing and citation, which is a very important big deal in writing papers in psychology. Whenever you use other people's words, ideas, information, or images in your own work, you need to identify the source accurately. Why? One, to give credit to the original creators of the work, and two, provide your reader with a reliable path to the original source. That number two is one of the most important ones. Of course, number one is important, but number two is vitally important because anyone who's reading your research is probably reading it because they have some idea that you're writing something, have done some research on something that is of interest to them. And so your research might be wonderful and great, but they also might want to look at the sources that you were able to locate as well. And that's what number two points to. Provide your reader with reliable path to the original source. Okay. Now, one thing that you've heard of all your life, I'm sure, as you've gotten to academic life in school, about plagiarism. Plagiarism is a form of academic misconduct that occurs when a student uses the work of others but fails to accurately cite it. Okay. Inaccurate citations make it difficult or impossible for your reader to locate the original source. Missing citations give the impression that you're trying to take credit for the work of others. That's going to be a really, really important idea to take with you to other classes as well, is that you need to understand that a missing citation implies that this idea is yours. And if you're not trying to communicate that, you need to make sure that somehow it's being cited. So some sort of an idea, and it can be somewhat of something you got to get experience at and used to. When you read something, you cite it most definitely, and you allow to make sure that there's a reference for it, but also you need to get practice paraphrasing things too, and I'll talk about that in a second. All right, first of all, what is the APA? We've talked about APA a couple of times, but what is APA style? APA style was created by the American Psychological Association. There are many other different styles, MLA, which I usually see with a lot of English majors and things of that nature, Chicago style and so on. And each one is basically a set of rules for, guess what? Referencing and formatting documents. Now, a couple of things I want to emphasize here, because I've seen them in even upper class student papers. APA does not use bibliography. So at the very end, when you're citing sources that you may have used for your paper, be it a long paper or a short paper, we normally don't see bibliography in APA, okay? Nor do we see at the very end works cited. Okay, what we usually see is references. APA does use references. So references is usually what we look at that last page, not works cited and not bibliography. If you're taking other classes now, they may be following different types of format where bibliography or works cited or something else may be well and good. But normally for APA, we will not see those. We'll see references. All right, getting to the meat of it here. Okay, so what does APA referencing look like? So here is basically a couple of ideas I want to make sure we understand. First, we have the in-text citation within the body of your paper, okay? And that's what we see here. So gives just enough information on a particular source to point the reader to the corresponding more detailed entry in the reference list. So let me read this real quickly. Educators and parents are becoming increasingly concerned about the addictive properties of social media. A recent study of secondary school students in the UK found that Instagram addiction was linked to declining mental health. And it states here, Taprobane and Brochure, 2018. Okay, now let me just highlight what that means for us. That is an in-text citation, all right? So that statement, a recent study of secondary school students, that's just basically saying that's where this author got it from the Taprobane and Boucher paper, and they highlight it there. So if you wanted to find out exactly what they said and how they stated it, and you needed something from that paper, the original source, because you knew it, they talked about something that you're very interested in, then you go to the references page at the back, and you have it here. And in the day of this new digital age, you could probably click on a link, and it could probably take you to it. All right. So this is the document with in-text citations here within the document. And that's the citation, the in-text citation. And then you can go find, by looking it up in the references section, where you can locate that document. That is the whole point of this, because remember, in psychology, it's about research. It's about people following up on other people's research, replicating their research. It's like a very decent club. They're exchanging information, learning from each other, following up with each other, replicating each other's study. And so this is a very convenient way for that information to be conveyed. Oh yeah, if you're interested in UK data about Instagram, hey, this people did that, and you can locate it by this source here in the reference list. Okay, so when it comes to in-text citations, what are the three elements that we are normally looking for these in-text citations? It's going to be the author's last name and year of publication. That's usually what we listen for. If you have a page number too, particularly for quotations. All right. So here we can look at a couple of formats. So here in this paraphrase, you have one researcher emphasized the necessity of flexible thinking for coping with rapidly changing technology. Lee, 2007, page 82. All right, so basically with a period. This is one thing too I want to make sure that people understand. Even in my upper level classes, they tend to put this period all over the place, but it goes here after the citation. So this is Lee, 2007, page 82. Or you can do it this way. Lee, 2007, here you have the author's name and the year of publication, emphasized that flexible thinking is vital for coping with rapidly changing technology. This is where it was found, page 82, which can be very beneficial. If you want to go directly to where it came from, you can list that page number. It's very helpful to individuals who are researching using your documents that you produced. And here's an example of a short quotation. I'm not fond of short of quotations in papers particularly. I know a lot of students use them just to take up space. All right, a short quotation. One researcher stated that, quote, the ability to think critically is needed in this revolutionary age of technological change, end quote. And then we have the citation here, Lee, 2007, page 82, then the period. Or over here, Lee 2007 stated, and then the same basic idea, just having the quotations listed, page number, and here. This note here at the very bottom, a quotation should not stand alone in its own sentence. You must incorporate quotations into your sentences. So you don't quote the whole thing and just put it there with none of your words. That's not the way it works. And my last add to this, paraphrasing is preferred over quoting. It's better to paraphrase as opposed to quote. I'm going to pause there to see if there's any comments or questions so far before we start to wrap things up. We only have a few more slides to go through. Anyone?
I have
Sure.
a quick question,
Sure.
if available. When do we need to submit like article, journal, and stuff so that we can have it approved before the paper? Will that come later?
You basically, what I, from the experience of doing this assignment, most people don't even do that. And what I normally say is this: if it's coming from one of the sources that we have identified on your Canvas site, it's usually going to be good to go. And all I'm looking for is to make sure that you're not getting some source from some sort of crazy website or something that may be inappropriate and not real legitimate. If that does that make sense?
It does make sense. I was just curious if we had to submit it to you, or if we go through these websites and find an article, can we go ahead and get started on this paper preparation?
Yeah, you can do that. There's no problem with that, particularly if you're getting it from a source that you feel comfortable that it is legitimate. Normally, if people have found something that they are not quite sure about, that's when they usually want to get it approved. And sometimes for a few, I don't want to open up this can of worms, but for a few, people chose to do something slightly differently. I've had people do episodes of a TV show or scenes from a TV show to do the same basic idea. So the idea is that's when they're doing something a little bit special, or they're not quite certain about the source, then that's when they usually contact me. Okay?
Understood. Thank you.
No problem. All right. So basically, yeah, I did that one already. So next, creating your reference list. I'm just going to show you basically the basic pattern for reference entry. Usually you have the author, the year of publication, the title of the work, and publication date. Okay, and again, if you've already done it, if you can do it again, but if you hadn't, go to the Canvas site and you can print out this APA document for academic writing and just review it to get familiar with it. I'll point out some of the things that I've seen and what most people do use by way of references. Here are some of the a snippet from some of the sources in reference instructions. So here for C9, we have newspaper article with author on the web, not from a library database. So here you see Harris M, 2011, August 16, the title of the article, the source, and then retrieved from. All right, newspaper article, author unknown. And so one of the things what we see with this 2 or 3 pages of this document that you have access to is the following. We know that not all the time will the world be kind to young researchers or even old researchers. And so you may not find every bit of information that you would like to have for a reference there. And so APA has provided you with many samples and examples of things that you can do if everything is not neat and orderly, that you don't have a year or you don't have an author. So that's usually a way around it. The whole idea is for you to provide some way for the in-text citation to be correlated or related to the reference list and direct the people who are reading your document to some way to get to that same document that you got to. All right, that's basically what it comes down to. And then we see magazine article with an author and print version, Singer P, the author's name, date, title, the magazine itself, and then information about it here. All right. Here's from another snippet from websites. Website with an author here, year, study habits for success, tips for students, that would be the title, and then retrieved and from and the link. Okay, and just to say why the retrieval date, this note tells us why they want that in APA. A retrieval date is required because the content of a web page can change over time. So that just says that you retrieved this information at that time. So it may have changed. The web page people may have changed some things, okay? All right, let's go to the next. And here's the one that I saw used quite a bit actually in the last few semesters I've been doing this particular assignment. Not necessarily Twitter, but here it shows you how you can do Twitter references. So if you cite something from Twitter, okay, you put it in your in-text citation, and this is how you do the reference for it here. And it gives you some note for information, if if it fits whatever you're looking at. But a lot of people use YouTube. Okay, so they found some things on YouTube, examples of things they wanted to use. And again here, real grumpy cat, the date, and year, title, video file retrieved from, and the YouTube link here. And this note here include both the real name and screen name of the person who posted the video as the author. In fact, this to give you a little bit of idea, I do video lectures for a lot of my classes now, and I've recently found when people are doing their written formal essay assignments or short papers, they're quoting me or referencing me, which is legit. Okay, so here the idea is that there are all sorts of things that you can do. There's information there about how you do lab notes or handouts from a class. So all this type of stuff is there. And here, the last one there is the motion picture with producer and director. So any motion picture, and I think there were maybe one student did something like that, they would have to put producer, director, year, this here, and that type of information. So what this is all doing is just providing us with enough information to be able to know the source, where it came from, to be able to access it ourselves. All right, moving on. Last few things on more on the assignment. Basically, this next few slides is about how it is that I went about collecting information for doing a particular type of assignment. So it's more about collecting information here. All right, so we look for psychology in the media, newspaper, radio, TV, internet, news story, whatever. The goal of this assignment is to find current events, research, and other media that relate to the concepts of psychology and to get practice applying the concepts. For your preparation, this is what I always normally suggest. Step one, using the resources identified below, or other reputable sources, okay, like Psychport, Psych Central, or the New York Times Health section. You can use these sources, okay, and they're usually going to be very reliable. I state don't use blog entries or sources that reflect somebody's personal philosophies rather than scientific ideas. Remember, we talked about a whole section previously about what we see out there. There are a lot of unscientific ideas. What we're looking for is trying to support the idea of big T or big truth here, things that are factually based. So the idea is normally you'll just be able to provide a link or some source like that. That'll be fine for me. You don't have to return something physically in, but a copy of the article or link somehow so I can check up on it myself or get access to it. For any source, please check with me to confirm the appropriateness of the current event, topic, or source. For example, another reason somebody may have done that for me is the article they found was rather old. Okay, not very current. Okay, but if it's something that is head on target and is from a legitimate source, that's usually fine. And then people have come to me talking about, SpongeBob. I didn't know what a SpongeBob was until recently. So, some little scene from SpongeBob they wanted to do. So those are the types of things that people can do, that type of stuff. The paper is going to be really brief. We're talking probably 2 pages maybe of content, maybe, if that. All right. And again, we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But again, I'm looking just for very specific things. After you've identified an appropriate current event, communicate the identity of the author, where and how the source was obtained. Step 2. So 1 is basically introducing your source. And then step 2, you should summarize the information selected in 1 paragraph. Write in at least 1 complete paragraph a descriptive summary of your selected source. What was the source? Who was the author? What is it about? Step 3, you're going to, using the psychology textbook, find concepts to relate to your source that you found. That's one of the key ideas. We're trying to relate this to ideas of psychology. And your textbook right now probably is going to be the best source for you when it comes to psychological ideas. You're going to review all that information you have obtained and all the information produced from these previous steps and produce your paper. So this is just basically my suggestion about how you can collect the information to get your stuff ready for writing that paper. Now, when you're writing that paper, the following things. 1, there's going to be a cover page. So we have the psychology news current event assignment. You can name it, title it, whatever. Okay. Then you put your psychology 210 section V1 for you guys. Present it and submit it. And why I want all this type of stuff, because I'm old school sometimes. I usually print this stuff out. If you don't have your name on it in some way for me to know who's who, whatever, and this has happened, unfortunately, I don't know what paper I'm grading. And that makes me kind of cranky. And so the grade usually is not going to be that good, or at least it could be a lot better if I wasn't in a cranky mood. All right. So basically, now on the content pages, start on the first content page, no more than 2 pages, not including the cover nor reference page. So basically, we have a cover page, maybe 2 pages of content, and then a reference page. So in a brief paragraph, communicate the authorship, where and how you selected your current event source. 2, and at least 1 complete paragraph, summarize the article or material, what was communicated in your source, what was the purpose of the communication, etc., and so forth. That's the bare minimum there. And 3, in at least 1 paragraph, discuss the psychological concepts and ideas as they relate to the material you obtained as a current event source. Explain how your selected material represents the identified psychological concepts, okay? Now here's a sample article. All right, so this is something from a long time ago. So this is an article that one could have used. It may have been used a year or so back. U.S. adults who binge drink are drinking even more, study says. This was something from CNN source. All right, so I just highlighted a few things that may be of interest. Alcohol, we'll have a whole section that will talk about that. Drugs, it's going to be consciousness in the 2-track mind. We have stuff here, average from, so here we're talking about statistics and percentages, serious health risks, the number of drinks consumed, and binge drinking. We'll talk about binge drinking and alcoholism a little bit later. So these are the types of things that you could be picking up from the source, okay, that you're looking at your current event source to collect the information that you'll be putting in the paper. The study noted significant increases, looking at education here, socioeconomic disparities, we'll be talking about that from time to time, and it goes further and further on. And so the idea here, this is the actual article, and so the notion is you read the article, you'll be pulling things out of the article, trying to understand it with regard to being able to summarize the key points of it, and then start thinking about how it is that you're going to relate it to the things that we have talked about in class or will be talking about in class. And here's a sample, not perfect paper, but a sample one. Here, this person did, working Americans are getting less sleep, especially those who save our lives. So here, obviously talking about first responders. And you can see the cover page here, for the most part, it is mentioned there. Then we have the first part, working Americans are getting less sleep, especially those who save our lives. This is an article written by, it identifies the author, it identifies who the author is associated with. It talks about the organization itself, NPR, aired in the 70s, making the company 50 years old, so on. So it gives me some sort of historical idea of who this person is, who they work for. Oftentimes, you can also give them a little bit of information about the person's background. If they are trained in this particular area, have they been doing scientific writing for NPR or whatever the source is? That's the way it goes. And then the summary part where they just describe what the article covered, okay, summarizing, paraphrasing, that type of thing is usually going to be the best idea. Obviously, this person could have probably cited something here, and this section is they summarize the article, okay, but the idea is there. We introduce the source, tell a little bit about the source, then we summarize that article in that next section. Then jumping to the other, there's other articles sections there, but I mean other paragraphs there, but jumping to the relating articles to topics here. Sleep deprivation, we'll have a section, again, the one on consciousness and the 2-track mind is where we talk about sleep, for example. Sleep deprivation causes severe lack of energy and well-being. This particular person cited our textbook here, all right? It can also decrease one's focusing ability and disrupt one's ability to process and store memories, a decrease in focusing ability, and so on and so forth. So here, what they're doing is relating some of the stuff they got from the current event article, showing and demonstrating they understand that, and showing us how they can relate it to the stuff that has been discussed or will be discussed in class or in the textbook. And then here we have the references. We did see Mitchell stated in one of the early, I think that was in the intro of the source. And so here, Mitchell A, 2014, which news organization is most trusted? The answer is complicated. All right, so here, for whatever reason, they have included all this information here, and it is alphabetized. and it is references. So that's how they are referencing material there. Okay, so that's the main items that I wanted to cover. It's 2:29 now. I'm still here. So is there any questions or comments that you guys, I'll be posting this a little bit later, but any comments or questions for clarification? All right, doesn't sound like there is any. All right, so what we're going to do now, I'm going to close the session out real soon here and have this posted a little bit later. I will also be opening up, if it's not already open, the Zoom handouts for our next session, which will be next week. I think it's going to be February the 9th. We will then be looking at the biology of behavior. Okay. If there are no other questions or comments at this time, you guys are free to skedaddle. Be safe, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.